With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, let's go back over to the UK because there's nothing major going on over there lately, if you even tangentially look at the headlines, but important topic. I'm looking forward to this. New face from our UK contributor, Sophia Worringer, is joining us from the UK. How are you, ma'am? Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks so much for having me on. Great to be here.
I appreciate you. Another one of our great Young Voices contributor. Also does some other things in her own right. We'll get to that in just a little bit. Well-traveled, too. Always appreciate that. You wrote a piece about the Queen, and I know people are like, well, why are we still talking about the Queen? I want to set it up this way to you, though, because when I talk to people that work in and around Parliament, when I talk to our UK friends while that was all going on, yes, to the American audience, yes, it's mostly ceremonial. Yes, it's, there's not really political power there. But when I talk to the people that actually work around, the constant of the Queen, the steadiness, the fact that she is the titular head of state, that was a real thing to Parliament. It was a stabilizing force in some ways. She dies, we have total chaos. It's not all just because of that, because it's economics and other things. Is there a little element here like this may not be as chaotic and as vitriolic as it was if the Queen was still there? Because everybody I talked to said that stabilization thing was a very real thing.
I think you're right in some ways. I think the Queen's constant presence over most of the last century now, and 70 years on the throne, was definitely a stabilising presence in Parliament. Obviously, she would open it every new parliamentary session. She only missed 2 or 3, I think, when she was very ill or heavily pregnant. And she was therefore a constant presence. And I think also a national focus of identity, of direction, of ceremony and tradition. And although her successor, King Charles, embodies much of that, his presence on the scene hasn't been quite as constant. And so therefore, I do feel like we have maybe lost some of that reassurance and steady hands. And I think as a national figurehead, she was incredibly unifying, and she would not get involved in the nitty-gritty of politics. She would not comment on political day-to-day activities, and her unifying presence will definitely be missed. And maybe there can be links drawn to the economic turmoil we see ourselves now in, but it may have to have more hindsight to exactly express how those things are connected.
Yeah, Sophia Worringer joining us. I think it's one of those passive things, though, of when you have somebody that's that revered and that respected and that beloved. I think there was something to it of just, well, you don't want to ever embarrass or let somebody like that down. It's a passive thing. It's not like something that's talked about. You don't get a memo at the beginning of Parliament sessions like, don't embarrass the Queen. It's just understood that, hey, when we do stuff, don't embarrass the Queen, don't embarrass the country. There's an element of that we're losing in societies. We're losing it in America, certainly. That kind of institutional thing. The British are kind of, y'all got that stereotype, stiff upper lip, carry on. You got the T-shirts, all that stuff. Is there a concern some of that might be a little bit slipping here, that we're maybe decorum's kind of becoming an issue a little bit?
I do think the UK public showed the extent of their love and devotion to the Queen in the outpouring of grief following her death. And obviously, the eyes of the world turned to Westminster as the funeral was broadcast. And I think people were quite surprised, maybe, about how emotional they became upon hearing the Queen had died. People who had never met her, people who had never even seen her. And I think there was something about that collective experience of loss in the country that has probably disorientated a lot of people over the last few weeks and caused people to be anxious about the future, to question what is Britain's place in the world. And I think the combination of changing head of state and changing government, changing prime minister happening all very quickly after a very kind of tumultuous few years in politics anyway, has definitely had an impact on the national psyche and has left many people feeling rudderless. So it's very important now that the king and the government, in whatever form that takes, puts emphasis on unity and moving forward and forging a new path for Britain. We can't replicate the Queen. King Charles cannot be his mother, but he can forge his own path, and it's really important that he does that.
Yeah, we'll talk about the political turmoil a little bit more in a minute, but y'all need some unity right now, and you're probably going to have some dark days before you get back to it. Let's talk about the Queen for a minute, because you were writing about it. You wrote about American Thinker. We'll read the whole piece. She also has a bunch of links inside the piece. You want to make sure you read through those too. When you're somebody like the Queen and you've been on the throne for 70 years and you have movies about you and you have prestige TV series about you, can't help but be a stereotype. We talk about it being marbleization, you know, the famous figures, they got their statue and you never get to the actual person underneath that. But you wrote about this. That person, the stereotypes didn't always hold up. You know, they talked about her being very traditional, maybe not being, you know, progressively feminist, but she also had a husband who famously, you touch on it in the piece, always walked 2 paces behind her. Like, you know, some of the stereotypes do match up, some of them don't. Walk us through a couple of those that you pointed out in your piece.
So I think what's really interesting is the Queen was both very traditional and yet also very reforming. So I've talked about the changes she made to the Crown succession of the Crown Act in 2013, which undid hundreds, if not thousands, of years of male preference primogeniture, where the line of the throne succession passed to the eldest male. She undid that so that any child of Prince William, who is now Prince of Wales, would be equally in line to the throne, whether they were born a boy or a girl. And that's actually very radical, particularly when you think of all of the disputes in history about not producing male heirs and all of the ways our country's history is shaped by this male preference primogeniture in the past. And she quietly undid that. And I think showed in that her very radical reforming agenda, but always in step with honouring tradition. And I think, therefore, some of the accolades around her, calling her a feminist, are correct in that she did believe in equality, and at the heart of feminism, that is what is believed, but not in the way modern liberal feminists often discuss feminism, which blurs the distinction of maleness and femaleness and gender. And I think actually the Queen, as well as being reforming in some ways, was very proud of being a female ruler and proud of her femininity, and so therefore stuck to more conservative values of her role, and understood her role to be very one of protecting institutions and conserving institutions. So in both hands, she was both conservative and reforming, and I think she bridged that gap very well and walked that path very smoothly.
That's Sophia Worringer joining us from over in the UK. Part of this is a perception issue because, you know, everybody's like, well, she was a very traditional woman. Well, by 1950 standards, she's pretty progressive. By 2022 standards, she's super conservative. How much of it is her own evolution? She reigned for so long that she spanned different eras, but she wasn't the same either, and not just because of age. She changed over time too. It was more subtle. It was more on the down low. Get us past the media perception, because I think when you look at it that way, it will change how we view her as a person first. That, hey, when she came to the throne, unexpectedly, by the way, people forget that part of it. She wasn't expecting to be queen when she was. It kind of got thrust upon her. There was a lot of change, even though it was subtle. And by the standards of her time throughout her lifetime, massive change in massive ways, that not only the royalty and the royal family, but the way she presented and represented her country changed as well.
Absolutely. She did in some ways represent this conservatism, this tradition, but as I mentioned, evolved into her role and saw the monarchy as evolving with her, I believe. And I think what is interesting is that the modern liberal feminist movement actually seeks, in some ways, to be more conservative, more traditional, more regressive than it portrays itself to be. So I mentioned in my piece the decisions to portray Joan of Arc and to understand Elizabeth I as a gender neutral, non-binary character. And I think actually those expectations actually put what it means to be a woman into a smaller box than the Queen allowed it to be put into. So those interpretations look back at strong female leaders in history and see that they displayed characteristics which were for that time unusual, such as having a female head of state in the case of Elizabeth I, and having someone address an army, in her case, the army going to defeat the Spanish Armada, or Joan of Arc, who wear men's clothes, she led an army, she went to speak to the king. All of those characteristics, modern liberal feminists are in danger of looking back at people like them and deciding that because they displayed these strong characteristics of leadership and courage and decisive strategy, they could not possibly be female, hence the decision to portray them as gender neutral or non-binary. And yet the Queen Elizabeth II, actually was more comfortable in her femininity than that their definitions allow. So she was very comfortable, obviously, in her finery, in the crown jewels, in her dresses and fur and feathers, but more maybe comfortable in her country clothes, rolling around in the mud, stalking deer around Balmoral, right? And we need to be very careful that we don't define leadership only through male categories. And she was able to decide that she was a leader and she was strong and she was female, and she didn't want to minimize that, but she was very comfortable with the definition of female extending to full military dress or deer stalking or all these different types of things, which modern liberal feminists are in danger of categorizing only as male. So I think in that sense, she was incredibly progressive. And I think therefore the modern liberal feminist movement is actually and ironically in danger of becoming more aggressive. I know that's not their intention, but with their narrow definitions of gender, they are in danger of that. And that's why it's so interesting.
Yeah, Sophia Worringer joining us. You have a great anecdote in here. Is something of a little bit of a lighter note because it's a heavy topic. It was jarring to the American audience and the international audience when you saw Princess Anne in the funeral procession in uniform, which kind of surprised some folks. And then there was, of course, the controversy that, Harry couldn't wear his, but we'll deal with that some other time. But you have a great little anecdote about Princess Anne having kind of and she was basically the caretaker of the Queen. She was the Queen's right hand. She spent more time with her than anybody else. She was with her every day, especially in the last few years with the health stuff. She was basically the caretaker for all practical purposes for folks that don't know. But Princess Anne had that same kind of high-minded, I'm here, I'm doing my job, that kind of day-to-day bravery stuff. But you had an interesting little anecdote about the time they actually tried to kidnap her, and it did not go well for that guy.
Yeah, exactly. So the Royal Princess Anne, is the only daughter of the Queen, and she's known for her no-nonsense approach. And there was an attempt to kidnap her from when she was driving in a car, and the person who attempted that got into the car, and she told them to go away, basically, very bluntly, told them that they were a silly man and that they should go away. She took no hostages at all. She was very clear what she wanted. And I think that has shows something of the Queen as well, because their relationship was so close. It was the Queen's wishes that Princess Royal would follow the coffin from Balmoral to Aberdeen, where it was flown to London, and she did that whole 6-hour journey in the car behind the coffin. And what is actually really interesting too is I saw the hearse and the coffin leave from London Westminster to go to Windsor, which is the outskirts of London, and it came near my house, and the rest of the royal family were ahead of the coffin in their cars, and then the coffin came, and then the Royal Princess Anne followed the coffin in a separate car. And I do think that shows something of the closeness of the relationship between the Princess Royal and her late mother, and that would have been a request of the Queen. So the no-nonsense attitude that we see in the Princess Royal, I think she learnt definitely from her late mother, and we can understand more about the Queen by understanding more about Princess Anne.
Yeah, Sophia Worringer. There was nothing in that funeral that wasn't planned out and approved down to the smallest detail. So yeah, stuff like that was absolutely not accidental. Let's come back to the present day. The Queen is gone. We had the respite from UK politics. We had the great, 10 days or so of national unity. Boy, howdy, that went away real fast. There's an economic crisis. There's a cost of living crisis. There's migrant crises. There's all kinds of crises. Let's just be blunt. There's a leadership crisis in the UK right now. I know Liz Truss came in with a really hard hand. It looks like it's going even worse than people feared it might. There's a leadership crisis in the UK right now. This is why I opened up with, even though she's not technically have political power, just having that steady and influence might be really missed right now. What's the state, just common folks on the street? What are, obviously you follow politics maybe more closely, but what do people think? Because the average person that doesn't follow policy and economics and politics, I got to imagine they're just looking at that and going, this is one hot mess of not good.
I think the public have now a fairly short fuse for political antics. Obviously, the summer was taken up by a very insular leadership race where only MPs and then only members of the Conservative Party could vote. And therefore, most of the public looking on felt excluded from that and didn't have much patience for all of the briefing and counter briefing that was going on during that race. But they were willing to put up with that because they felt like stability would be delivered at the end and there would be a leader that would take them forward into this new chapter. And I think the Prime Minister now needs to be incredibly clear with the public about her direction. If she wants to completely continue to pursue this direction of tax cutting and growth, which obviously the UK needs. The UK does need growth after we recover from the pandemic. That is very important. She needs to be clear in her communication. And I think the problem has been is that she has moved too quickly for the public to keep up. And at the end of the day, people are going to look at the money that's in their pockets, right? They're going to look at their mortgage rates, which are going to be fixed for 2 or 3 or 5 years at a very high rate. They're going to look at how much money they have left over at the end of the month once they've paid their energy bills. And so I think economic fiscal responsibility is incredibly important. But even more important than that is the communication of the policies of where the country is going and the direction and vision for the country. And I think that's what's been lacking over this tumultuous period, is that the country has not been taken on the journey of why these cuts or growth is important, and therefore there's been a disconnect between the policies and the communications, and therefore people feel very confused, very in the dark. And most of the people in the UK, rightly so, are not in the Westminster bubble. They don't read the newspapers every day in incredible detail. They will just look at the headlines. And so it's very important that the government communicates very clearly and very top line as what's going on, so that people can go on this journey with them.
Yeah, Sophia Worringer joining us from the UK. If this turns into a longer term economic crisis, let's say past next year, past 1 or 2 elections, we're going to probably wind up with a general election sooner rather than later somewhere in here. If this turns into a multi-year recession, God forbid, or this just doesn't seem like it's going to end, does this go from just being a political crisis to being a transformational moment for the UK? Because it kind of is starting to feel like people are not just questioning leadership, they're starting to question the parties, they're starting to question the structure. The UK's role in the world is evolving. The demographics of the UK are changing. There's a lot of things moving at once in the UK right now. Does this feel like something that this may be a crisis that goes beyond just solving the crisis of the moment? This might be a generational change type of moment.
I think so, because I think the death of the Queen was always going to be a seminal moment in UK identity and understanding of belonging, direction, and national pride. And I think now that has happened, we are left with this landscape, which is fairly unshaped, of who we are on the global stage. What is our role? What does it mean to be British? What are British values? And I think following, obviously, from the Brexit vote, there are still quite severe divides between various people and geographical entities in the UK. And I think, therefore, we are at a crossroads as to who we are and what we stand for. And I think there's been very quick cultural change as well in the UK. If you think in comparison to America, for example, we are a very small population and we've had very big demographic shifts. We've had cultural and value shifts that have been almost over less than a decade, very quickly changed. And I think our sense of unity has not kept up with the sense of change. And so therefore we are definitely at a crossroads, and it's important therefore that we tap back into what it is to be British and what holds us together and really focus on that.
Yeah, Sophia Worringer, crisis always reveals. So it'll be interesting to see what our UK friends come out the other side of this crisis looking like. And we do hope our special relationship continues, because we sure do enjoy our friendship with y'all. Appreciate the conversation. Love talking about this stuff. Appreciate your insight. Till we get you back on the show in the future, though, let folks know where they can follow you, what you have going on, and how they can keep up with you until we get you back on Hertel again.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Sophia Worringer. I'm working at a think tank called the Centre for Social Justice, looking at routes in and out of poverty in the mid-2020s. So you can follow the work of the Centre for Social Justice online too.
Yep, and we'll link to her page, Young Voices, and also her social media. You're going to have plenty of business on that poverty thing, because it looks like it's going to be tough economic times for the foreseeable future. So good luck with that. Thank you so much for the conversation and the time, Sophia Worringer. Thank you very much, ma'am.